Now that we've taken care of a few of the basics, let's get started on designing this part from scratch. We're going to start a new part using our part metric template. Now, the first thing we need to do is decide whether we're going to be doing an additive or a subtractive modeling process. Because this part is very minimal in terms of the amount that's left over from the original stock, we're going to go ahead and do an additive type of modeling. So I'm going to start by creating the base. And to do this, I'm going to sketch on my top plane. And I want to start by using my polygon option. Now, when you select polygon by default, it's going to have 6 set for the number of sides. I'm going to use an inscribed circle, and this is going to create a new polygon. Now I simply need to start by selecting the origin and dragging this out into space. Now once I have, I'm going to hit the escape key. I'm going to hit my S key and use smart dimensions. The inscribed circle I'm going to set to 350 millimeters. Then I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to select one of the lines and I'm going to make it horizontal. This will give me a fully defined sketch. The next thing I want to do is create an offset entity. So I'll select offset entity from my sketch tab. I'm going to select one of the lines and I'm going to reverse this. I want it to offset inward. Now the offset amount is going to be 15 millimeters. Let's go ahead and say OK and exit our sketch. Now I want to go to my Features tab and select Extruded Boss Base. The distance is going to be 50 millimeters, and under Blind, I'm going to use the drop-down end condition and select Midplane. This will equally extrude 25 millimeters above my top plane and 25 millimeters below. This is a great way to start your parts because our sketch is set to the origin, so everything is centered and fixed about the origin. And when I start to use my midplane options for creating my first solid, I know that everything is symmetric about the top plane or the standard planes, if you will. Now this part is not going to be symmetric from here on out, but this is a very handy option to get started with any of your parts. Let's go ahead and say OK. The next thing I want to do is expand Boss Extrude 1, select Sketch 1, and go ahead and do another extrude. Now in this case, I want to scroll down to Selected Contours. I'm going to right click and I'm going to clear selection. Then I want to select the inside. For my end condition, I'm going to again select midplane. And for the distance, we're going to say 25 millimeters. Say OK. Now what we've done is we've created an outside hex that has a 15 millimeter wall thickness that is 25 millimeters taller above and below. And we have a center section that is 25 millimeters thick. If we do a section view of this, you can see what we've done is we've created an I-beam section. Let's go ahead and hit the X to get out of our section view, and let's continue adding a bit of geometry. Because we have sketched on our top plane to start and everything is extruded about that, let's go ahead and select the top plane and start a new sketch. The next thing we want to do is we want to sketch a 75 millimeter circle. So I'm going to start by grabbing the circle tool. I'm going to use my center point option, and I'm going to just start drawing it up and to the right of my origin. This is going to be a 75 millimeter diameter, and we're going to use the S key, go to Smart Dimension, and dimension it to the origin, a distance of 100 millimeters. Now you'll notice by hitting the Escape key that when we look at our circle, it's still blue. I'm still free to drag this thing around. It still is underdefined. So the next thing I want to do is hit the L key on my keyboard to start the line tool, select For Construction. I'm going to go from the origin to one of my hex points, in this case the one up and to the right. Then I'm going to hit Escape to exit the line tool. And while the line is still selected, I'm going to hold down the Control key and select the center point of my circle. From the Quick Context menu that pops up, we have 3 options for constraints. We have Make Midpoint, Make Coincident, and Fix. The option we want is Make Coincident. If you're not comfortable using the Quick Context menu and the tooltips that pop up, make sure you go over to the left side in the Properties and select Coincident. Now we have a fully defined sketch, which you can see in the bottom of your modeling window, as well as noting that the sketch entities have turned black. We can go ahead and say OK. Now we're going to do an extrude cut. Now the extrude cuts are just like the positive extrudes. It's going to be going a single direction by default. In this case, we're going to use the dropdown, and it's going to say Through All, and we're going to say Both. This allows me to go completely through the geometry in both directions and say OK. The next thing we can do while this feature is still selected is go to our linear pattern dropdown and do a circular pattern. Now you'll notice that when we do a circular pattern here, it wants to have a center point for the axis. If we try to select something like the edge of the hex, it's not going to be able to pattern around anything here. We really need something in the center of this, or we need to create a reference axis. Because I know we're going to have some geometry in the center, let's go ahead and create that geometry. We're going to again select the top plane, create a new sketch, and we're going to draw another circle. We're going to do a center point circle from the origin, and this one again is going to be a 75mm diameter. Now, once we hit escape twice, you'll notice that this circle is fully defined because it's constrained at the origin and the diameter is 75mm. We can exit the sketch, and we can do an extruded boss base. Again, we're going to do midplane, and the distance this time is going to be 100mm. Once we say OK, we now have a boss above and below the part that's 100mm. Now we can go back to our feature tree, left click on Cut Extrude 1, go back to our linear pattern, and select circular pattern. Now the reason I pre-select the feature inside of the feature tree is because it makes it a little bit easier when you come in here. Now you don't necessarily have to pre-select them. If I clear this, I can either select the feature on the screen by one of the faces that was created by doing the cut, or I can expand the tree inside of the modeling window, and I can go down to the feature and select Cut Extrude 1. But pre-selecting it sometimes just seems to be a little bit easier, especially if you're going to be using multiple features. Now, if you use multiple features, you can hold down the Control key and select those as well. But in this case, we're only going to be patterning a single feature. For my axis of revolution, in this case, because we have the boss in the center, we can simply select a circular edge, and that gives us a reference to pattern. We're going to be using 360 degrees, an instance number of 6, and we want to make sure that we select equal spacing. Now we can say OK. Now we've taken that original circle, and we've patterned it 6 times around our part. Next, we're again going to select the top plane and start a new sketch. Now, in this case, what we want to do is we want to create an 18mm hole that's 135mm away. But there's something I want to mention here. Because we're going to be creating a hole and then we're going to be patterning it 6 times around the part, we can do 2 different things here. We can create a new sketch, create a new extrude cut, and create a new pattern, or we could hit the X, discard our changes, go back into the sketch that was used to create this hole, in this case the Cut Extrude 1, select it, and we can edit this sketch. I'm going to use Control 8 on my keyboard to show normal to this view, and I'm going to start a new center point circle. Now in this case, I'm going to go above the origin until I see that dashed blue line, select, and I'm going to place an 18mm hole. And then hit escape twice, select the center point of this hole, Control select the origin, and use the Make Vertical Relation, then use my S key, go to Smart Dimension. With those 2 points still selected, it'll automatically dimension it for me, and I want to place a 135mm dimension. So now you'll notice that I have a second hole in this sketch. Once we say OK, it automatically did an extrude cut both directions through all, and it automatically included it in the pattern because we selected the feature to pattern. So this is a great way to make sure that the feature tree is clean and you don't have any additional features that you don't need. For instance, a secondary extrude cut and a secondary circular pattern. This makes the feature tree much cleaner and much more efficient when you rebuild your geometry. Now we're going to add some more geometry to the center of this part. Now, because we need to add a little bit more geometry, we could build it up by doing a couple extrudes to get that geometry, or we could just go ahead and do a revolve. In this case, we're going to select either the right or the front plane, and we're going to start a revolve. Now, the first thing I want to do is go to my Convert Entities dropdown and select Intersection Curve. Then I'm going to select the upper boss and say OK, and hit OK twice. Now what this does is it creates a curve, or a line in this case, where it intersects that geometry. I'm going to select the line on the left, hit the Delete key to remove it, select the line on the right, and convert it to construction geometry. Now this can be done from the Quick Context menu that pops up by going to the Options and selecting For Construction, or if you have a quick key set up on your keyboard, for me it's the C key, you can then convert it to construction automatically. Now we want to start by sketching a bit of geometry. Using L on the keyboard to start the line tool, we're going to start at the midpoint of this upper edge, drag up to the left, up vertically, into the left, up vertically again, back over to the left, and then down to the starting point of our line. We can hit Escape to end the line tool twice, zoom in, use the S key, and add smart dimensions. Now for this first example that we're doing, I'm calling out all the things I do to create my tools. For instance, hitting the S key, selecting certain geometry, and so on. As we get farther in this tutorial series, we're not going to be calling out all these features. You should become comfortable with accessing these tools just by seeing what tools I'm using. So let's start by adding a few dimensions. First, I'm going to select this line, and I'm going to create a 20 millimeter height. Next, I'm going to select the center line and this line, and I'm going to create a 15 millimeter dimension. Next, I'm going to select this secondary line, and here we're going to create a 25 millimeter dimension. We're going to select the horizontal bottom line, this line that's up and at an angle. We're going to add a 45-degree taper. And lastly, we want to create an overall height, in this case, 75 millimeters tall. So now you'll see that we have a fully defined sketch as shown in the bottom area of our modeling window. And note the fact that all of the sketch entities are now black. We can now exit the sketch, and while it's still highlighted, select Revolved Base. Now once you do this, sometimes it'll automatically show you a preview on the screen. In this case, there are many different edges that we could use to revolve this, so it's waiting for our input. We want to select the tall vertical line, and what we've done is we're creating a preview of the revolve. In this case, we want to make sure that we have merge results selected and say OK. Now you can see we've created some additional geometry that, with a single revolve feature, captured this tapered edge, this vertical edge, and the smaller inner diameter here. If we were to do this by creating multiple extrudes, we would have to create one extrude here, and an additional one here. So creating the revolve saved us a lot of time, even though we're still doing a machined part and not a part that's going to be turned on a lathe. Let's go ahead and step back for a second and take a look at the part we're creating. We have most of the base geometry set out, but we still have a little bit that we need to add in terms of details. We're going to cover that in another video.